Good evening. My name is Rachel Lane, and I work on the communications and marketing team at the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. We are so excited to welcome you to our first virtual programming event of the 2025-2026 season. So to kick things off, we'd love to see where people are joining us from. So feel free to drop in the chat where you're tuning in from. As we get started, and we'll wait for those to filter in if you'd like, we're excited to kick off this year's virtual programming series, and I'm especially delighted to welcome David Gessner, who is a best-selling author and creative writing professor at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. He's written 14 books, including Leave It As It Is, A Journey Through Theodore Roosevelt's American Wilderness. And that's the book that he's going to be speaking about this evening. In 285 days, on July 4th, 2026, the Presidential Library will open its doors in North Dakota's Badlands, which is where Theodore Roosevelt first developed many of his ideas about conservation. Since conservation is a topic of great importance to Theodore Roosevelt and was one of his most important legacies, we thought it was only fitting to begin this year's virtual programming series with David's book, as he seeks to humanize, not lionize, Theodore Roosevelt, just like we hope to do so at the library. This is supposed to be an interactive book talk, so we invite questions. Put them in the chat, and we'll make sure they get answered during the Q&A time at the end. So I'll make one note. We have someone who popped on saying that tuning in from Nebraska, so hey, and we look forward to any questions that anybody would like to contribute. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome David.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, Matt. I was invited to do this, and I was nervous not because I don't like talking in front of people, but because this is 3 books ago, Teddy Roosevelt book, Leave It As It Is. And when I was starting as a writer, I kept being accused of being a nature writer. I thought I was a writer, not a nature writer. And so I wrote a book from Colorado about Cape Cod called A Wild Rank Place. And then I moved to Cape Cod and wrote a book about Colorado called Under the Devil's Thumb. And they kept calling me a nature writer. So I finally wrote a book called Sick of Nature, which was my declaration of independence from the nature genre. And I've come to believe over the course of 14 books that sick of the last book is a good motto in a way, because you get so obsessed and you go so hard into these things for a few years that you want to do the opposite. Like after my last Western book a few books ago, I did a book about ultimate frisbee. So I kind of rebel against myself, which means that I'm not a historian. I'm not Edmund Morris, and I might forget a few things from the book a little while ago. I did do a book right after my Teddy book, which was about Henry David Thoreau. And that book started with an anecdote about going to Walden Pond with my daughter Hadley, who then was 1 year old, on my shoulders and my wife next to me. And we walked around the pond until we got to the site where Thoreau's cabin was. And I said to my daughter and my wife, that's where the man lived who ruined Daddy's life. I meant it half jokingly, but reading Thoreau in high school had sent me into this weird world of loving nature and which I already did, and writing about nature. I could say tonight that this book was the book that saved Daddy's life in a way. I tried to be a writer throughout my 20s, and I didn't meet with success until my 30s. And those were hard years. I worked as a carpenter's apprentice and as a bookstore clerk. And I remember falling into what might have been my life's only true depression. And of course I get down like you do. But when you're in a real depression, you get a little glimpse of what truly depressed people are like. And I just happened to read The Rise of Teddy Roosevelt, and I felt kind of like it was a contagious book. It was bristling with energy, and I'd read it and want to go for a run, or start to write with more ambition. And I think that's really one of the fascinating things. I don't consider myself a biographer. My book is a biographical adventure. I go on it, and I lean on other biographies as I do it. But what I love most about biography, I had a great professor in college. His name was Walter Jackson Bate. He wrote two Pulitzer Prize winning books, a biography of Samuel Johnson and one of John Keats. And I think it was the John Keats biography that led me to becoming a writer as much as Thoreau. And he talked about why biography is so exciting is because it's something we can put to use in our own lives, and we can pick and choose. And Roosevelt is a classic example of that. Whether it's throwing yourself energetically into work, working on multiple things at once, just the curiosity about the world. I'm a birder, so obviously I I love that part of him too. So um, I read that. I think I also read Mornings on Horseback by David McCullough when I was young. And then I lived out east. I lived in Massachusetts, and I found out I had testicular cancer at 29. And at 30, um, I was operated on. I had radiation. I applied to graduate schools, and I only got into one in creative writing, believe it or not. And it was University of Colorado Boulder. And it was that drive west and that experience of going west that changed me as a person and as a writer. So obviously, the Medora sections, which are brilliant in Morris's book, struck a chord with me. And as so many of us coming from the East often find ourselves transformed and changed going west. So one of the things I did in the West is I explored Southeast Utah quite a bit. Um, I know, I'm sure a lot of people here have been there and know it's otherworldly, strange. It says Badlands onto its own, right? It's a similar kind of experience. And I really fell for it and I wrote about it some. And then about, what is it now? It would have been around 2015, I was asked to contribute to a book that was called Red Rock Testimony by a place called Torrey House Press, and it was a celebration of the land that would become Bears Ears, the national monument in southeast Utah. Most of the writers were either native people or Westerners, and I was kind of the token Easterner who was invited to contribute. But I was really proud to do it, and I tried to do a good job. And then that book was distributed by the editors, by Stephen Trimble and Kirsten Allen, to Congress. They went out and they lobbied for Bears Ears. Now, Bears Ears was the first, and this is why it's interesting, and this is a big part of the book. It was the first national monument to be conceived and planned out by Native American tribes, 5 tribes: Ute, Mountain Ute, Navajo, let's see, Hopi, Zunis, got together and they studied the Antiquities Act, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit, and proposed this saving of Bears Ears, this sacred land. So I was thrilled. I'm very involved in. I'm about to head out west. I live in North Carolina, but I head out west next week, and of course, it's another fraught time for public lands. But it was a thrilling moment when Bears Ears was declared as Obama was leaving office. It was much more personal, of course, for people like Regina Lopez White Skunk, who was the Mountain Ute leader who helped create the bill, but it was thrilling for me as well. So it also got me thinking about the Antiquities Act, an important player in my book and in the world. Basically, the misconception is that Roosevelt created the Antiquities Act, and it was actually passed by Congress, mostly and specifically to save, historical sites, what we used to call Anasazi ruins, ancient Puebloan ruins, and there was a line in there that said it is up to the discretion of the president. Well, discretion, president, Roosevelt. These are words that don't really go together. So, of course, he took that act and, as a lover of nature and wilderness and public lands, started to aggressively save lands, culminating really in terms of size in the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon would go through a process that many of these national monuments would go through. The Antiquities Act allowed him to declare it as a national monument, but it eventually moved toward a national park, obviously. Um, so all this is going on, and I'm starting to think I, they're great Roosevelt biographies. I don't know if I have a right to do this, but I'm thinking I'm going to write uh, uh, about Teddy and the Antiquities Act. And then, really, the day that created the book was October 27th, 2016, which is, as probably, if I get my facts wrong, feel free to correct me in the chat, but which was Roosevelt's birthday. It was also the day that Ryan Zinke, the new Department of Interior um, Secretary, declared, standing in front of a portrait of Roosevelt and calling himself a Roosevelt Republican, that Bears Ears would be reduced by 85%. That felt like, somebody had put the bat signal in my backyard or something, and it was time for me to throw my cape on. But basically, I headed out to Bears Ears. I interviewed Regina Lopez White Skunk, and asked her about the formation of this national monument. I asked her about the Antiquities Act, and she said, "I've got it memorized." We went, we knew what we were doing, and we worked hard to do it. Um, and then I went down to the Grand Canyon, and where the book gets its title, um, and uh, and kind of said, "This is it. I'm committed to doing this book." I'm not going to read much. I've I've learned that reading tends to put people to sleep, but I do want to give a sense of, there are three main modes in the book, and I'll read little bits of each of them. But the first mode is, each section has a prelude or an interlude in the third person. I write, for instance, a third person interlude about John Muir and Roosevelt as, sleeping in the snow and camping in Yosemite. But the first one, and it's not going to make much sense because I'm going to just read little chunks of it so I don't take up too much of our time, but I'll read a little bit. This is how the book starts with the prelude. Theodore on the edge. He stands on the edge of the world, the great shimmering orange, red, and bruise colored chasm opening below him. Ravens lift off and ride the wind. He is bristling with energy at this moment, which is to say, it is like most of his waking moments. Curious, always curious, he is a lover equally of the world and books about it. On the ride up here through the small juniper forest, always the show off, he pointed out and named all the birds he saw to his companions. From his horse he studied the chickadees and towhees and pinyon jays and nuthatches, their calls higher pitched than those back east, and stopped to listen to the sound of a woodpecker cracking open a pinyon nut. He knows these birds, knows their names, and he knows this canyon too, though until today only through the words of others. Then I go into uh, how he got there, which some of you will know, the famous train trip that went all around the country, that was really the first time somebody had really hit the campaign trail in that way. And he just gave many speeches each day. And that section ends with me saying, "We humans are an elsewhere," the poet Reg Sonner will one day write. "Teddy is more elsewhere than most, except when he isn't. Because for someone so ambitious, so eager to get on with the next task, he is shockingly good at slowing down time, at what we might call, in a phrase he would no doubt find disagreeable, being in the now. Whether he is staring down at a charging grizzly, or diving into the bracing winter water of Washington, D.C.'s Rock Creek Park, or listening to the music of wind tinkling the cottonwood leaves, he seems to have the gift of becoming absorbed. Hugely important gift, I think, to have. Um, this comes through most famously in the bouts of roughhousing with his children on the White House lawn. Even while burdened by the presidency, He has an enviable ability to slough off heavy loads and simply enjoy himself. But nothing takes him out of himself quite like nature. He has already snuck off while camping at Yellowstone, walking 18 miles alone to study a herd of elk, and in less than 2 weeks, his 14,000-mile road trip will climax when he leaves his Secret Servicemen behind and embarks on a legendary excursion with the great prophet and protector of the natural world, John Muir. That excursion in Yosemite will be long remembered as perhaps the most famous camping trip since Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. Think of it, the President of the United States sleeping outside under the stars with the country's most famous lover of nature. Details from the night are sparse, but we do know that the President was critical of the prophet's bird knowledge and that the prophet questioned the morality of the President's bloodlust as a hunter. But I wonder what else happened as they stared into the fire and talked. Perhaps a form of osmosis affected Roosevelt, perhaps the idea that wilderness was vital, not just for any human purpose, but for itself began to grow. So as you see, I like work through in the third person. And this first section, of course, ends with the speech that that gives the book its title. And I won't read it. I actually think Larry Marple, who's a great TR, um, im, not an imitator, there's a better word, impersonator, um, uh, could read it if he was here, but he'd read it better than me. So um, I'll just say one thing that that he says in it of the natural world and public lands. Whatever it is, handle it so your children's children will get the benefit of it. That's an important line because it's become an environmental cliche. Oh, for your children's children. But it was original then. And if we think about what it means that we're saving this land, and particularly now, it's such a fraught time, as a gift to our children and their children, if we can break through and bring that cliche back alive, um, that to me is exciting. And of course, he ends with the simple words, leave it as it is, which is a radical idea, really, to not, you know, this was at the Grand Canyon where people wanted to profit off this marvelous thing. What if we just left it as it was? He not only was creating something new, this talk of saving the environment. Obviously, it's not new historically. Native tribes and philosophers, Mr. Thoreau, for instance, but it's new in the political realm in this way, and he's creating almost the whole arena that this is being that this will be fought in. So for me, that's like basically like the Gettysburg Address of environmentalism, where Churchill's blood, sweat, and tears kind of thing. Um, so anyway, back to our story. So I've decided to do this book about Teddy, and I'm not going to do it as a straight biography, right? So I go and find my nephew Noah, who's in North Carolina in Asheville and graduating from college and hasn't been west of the Mississippi, or was once, but has never driven west of the Mississippi. And we head out on this road trip where we head up the coast. We go to TR's house. We go to Harvard, where Teddy went to school, and then we head out to the Badlands. And it was really exciting to see. I think I have it written somewhere. Um, what Noah was just watching his eyes open as we entered the Badlands, and that's the other mode that the book is in. And I'll just read one paragraph to give you a sense. It was once we got to the West, just the beginnings of the West, true, but the real West, I insist, that the trip turns strange. From down in the valley, amid the hoodoo rocks where we were camping, the buffalo up on the ridge appeared to be making love to my car. Of course, technically they were American bison, and they were not making love to it, not yet at least, but rather seemed to be in the early stages of wooing. There were three, maybe four, it was hard to tell from over half a mile away, and they were rubbing up against the car's side. My traveling companion, my nephew Noah, pointed out that what was happening made some sense, given the fact that the boxy vehicle, a Scion XB, was curiously bison shaped, humpback and all. And he was right. It fit in well with the herd. The next day, when we climbed up and out from our campsite, we would find the rearview mirrors flattened and streaked of dried mud running down the car's sides, streaks that refused to come off for the rest of the trip, no matter how much rain and hail fell. So that's the other mode. And I go, and Noah and I head out. We go to Yellowstone and, of course, get caught in the endless traffic jams as people watch more bison. We head down to the Grand Canyon, and I try to kind of bring the reader along with me. The other thing I try to do, and Rachel, when she invited me to do this talk, brought up, is try to, it's a standard biographical move to say this person was this, and and I don't know what, not a racist and then to kind of move on, just briskly move on. What I tried to do was show Teddy warts and all. Like, for instance, I mentioned how he was ahead of his time environmentally, brilliantly ahead of his time. Well, he was behind his time in other ways, in some ways too. We think about him in Manifest Destiny and rushing, and Manifest Destiny at that point was an old concept. There were plenty who had pushed on by it, but of him racing across the continent and not caring at all about the native people. He would evolve somewhat in that way. And later on, of course, he's got the kind of Nordic superiority theories. But so giving those credence, but also allowing for the messiness of all of us, in this. And if you remember, I mean, we're in a weird point. I'm not going to be political on either side. I want to keep my job for one thing. But if we remember that moment in time, that when my book is coming out, it's 2022, and the cancel culture is in full swing. And they've just taken down poor John Muir, who, in my mind, had written a few lines that, taken out of context, looked pretty bad. But to my mind, um, uh, it wasn't enough to take down a great life. So I knew I was coming out with this book, and I was going to try to, the way you would with a friend who has flaws. I was going to acknowledge the flaws, but also I'll talk about love in a little bit. And I remember one of the first things I did was post that the book was out on Facebook. And one of the first snarky comments was, there were nice comments, but was, do you realize how Teddy Roosevelt treated Native Americans? And I just wrote back, yes, I do. Or, well, yes, I do. Just spent 4 years studying the guy. But so that was the moment it was. And I wrote an article for a place called American Scholar, because at the moment the book came out, his statue was being taken down. And I think, we can, when the conversation starts, I'm happy to talk about this, but I think I'll read a couple paragraphs from this to give you a sense of kind of what I was feeling at the time. Teddy's statue is coming down, and Teddy would be happy. Happy because he hated the idea of statues of himself almost as much as he hated being called Teddy. Happy because he would have agreed that this particular statue, in front of the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, in which he rides a horse and is flanked by a Native American and a nearly naked African man, represents the worst of him, while the museum's Hall of Biodiversity, which will now be renamed after him, represents the best. And happy because he is back in the news, still making headlines as he rounds the corner toward his 162nd birthday this October. As his daughter, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, famously said, he wanted to be the corpse at every funeral, the bride at every wedding, and the baby at every christening. Having just spent 4 years writing a book about Theodore Roosevelt, I am familiar with both his strengths and flaws. Here is a man who ran for president in 1912 as a bull moose candidate with a platform that would have made Bernie blush. I don't know if you're going to have Kathleen Dalton come and talk about her wonderful book, The Strenuous Life, but she believes that it isn't the making his body transformation or the going out west to Medora transformation that is the most startling transformation. Um, it's this late move into progressivism, that this is kind of um, this maturing. That's kind of one of the things her book ends on. Anyway, back to uh, our programming. Um, Here is a man who ran for president in 1912 as a bull moose candidate with a platform that would have made Bernie blush, anticipating his distant cousin Franklin's New Deal with his own square one, but whose America First mania also left him blind to the plight of Native people and who entertained twisted racial theories that make us wince. Here is a messy, complex, sometimes hypocritical, wildly entertaining man, a lover of friends, family, and country, an energetic volcano whose idea of fun was preaching to everyone else about how they didn't live up to his high moral standards. Here is a man who aggressively pushed progressive policies for workers, women, and minorities, helping the nation get to the very spot from which we can now look back and criticize him, and who, by the way, helped save 230 million acres of American land. Not that we shouldn't criticize him. We should and we have, and he has proven he can take a punch. And though I fully support taking the statue down, my hope is that we don't take Roosevelt down with it. To reiterate, it's complicated. In Roosevelt, we have a test case for our own powers of historical empathy. I want to stress that phrase, historical empathy, the ability to look back and imagine what it would be like to live then and how you would have behaved. A test case for whether we are going to continue to sit in the comfortable perch of the present and pass judgment on figures from the past, consigning them to heaven and hell like amateur St. Peter's. Um, that's what he is, a test case. I'm in no way claiming we shouldn't be critical of these figures. I'm only suggesting that we practice empathy and cut people some slack for the time they happen to live in. In the not too distant past, say 5 years ago, it was common to subject historical figures to two simple tests of the imagination. How would we have acted then, and how would they act today? Now it seems we've been too lenient on everyone, all too willing to pull down almost any figure once deemed admirable. I think this test, I you know, I I can't imagine Teddy, who was such a learner and reader, such an aggressive reader. Another thing I loved about him, right? You know, reading is like reading is an illness with me, a sickness with me. Um, uh, I can't imagine him not evolving past some of those early um, beliefs. So I guess that's what I'm asking for. That's a very hard thing to ask for in this day and age, right? Is a kind of big-heartedness. I thought, having given him some flack, I wanted to. I mentioned the Yosemite story. That's one of my favorites. Probably a lot of your favorites too. When he's mired, the journalists say he was mired in the snow, which is kind of funny to imagine him wallowing through the snow, trying to get away from the press. He's left that party with all the expensive donors to go camp with Muir. And when Muir writes about it, he says, um, uh, he says, uh, I I couldn't help it if I felt some love for the man, or part of me loved the man. And this is going to they're going to take away my biographer's guild card. But I felt spasms of love too when I was writing this book. I um, I love the energy that I mentioned that saved me when I was younger. I love the just, I guess gusto is the word, right? And I love the way that can be kind of contagious. I love the story, like when he was with Dowell and Sewell. They're chasing the boat thieves who've stolen their book on uh, the Little Missouri, and it's covered with ice, chalk with ice, and he's in the back reading Anna Karenina. To me, that's like, you know, I have found that you could see my mountain bike over here, a little part of it. I found that sports really feeds my writing life, and nature feeds those both. And so for me, to see those things together what was so exciting. So the one thing uh, I want to say is that um, for for me his ideas about saving parks, national monuments, uh, all wilderness land were a central part of this book. And I finished, near the end of the book, I I I wrote this small section. As I look toward the future, I don't want to abandon the past. What TR left us in the end was a story about nature. It's a pretty damn good story, one that has worked out quite effectively for over a century. As we have discovered, there are flaws in the story, some due to the times he lived in, and some due to his own unique biases. Roosevelt is dead, and so he can't revisit his story. That is up to us. We need to tell a new story about wilderness for a new time. With any luck, we can tell a story half as inspired as his. We likely won't, but we must try. We owe it to the land and to the animals and to ourselves to try. I knew and I know that public lands, being once again under threat, won't magically save us from ourselves. And I really do think by saving that land, we're saving ourselves. But I also believe that they are one of the best things about us. It is my hope that we as Americans will come to understand our legacy and its power and to protect it from the threats of the avaricious and short sighted. And while we have to create a new story for this fight, a larger, more inclusive, more connected story, we don't have to come up with a new rallying cry. That has been with us from the fight's beginning. Leave it as it is. So, the story I'm talking about here circles back in the book to Bear's Ears. Because what I love is the way Regina used the Antiquities Act and the way it represented the old story of saving land. But, and that story itself has come under criticism, and rightly so in some ways. Like, Wallace Stegner called national parks America's best idea. Uh, However, we recently said, well, these were native lands, and they were taken away to create these parks, which is true and it should be acknowledged. But what else should be acknowledged is that we were rapaciously coming west, and we weren't about to. It wasn't a choice between a national park and a pristine wilderness that we didn't touch. It would have been developed in such a way. So what the parks did, whatever criticisms they might come under, is they kept possibility open. So Bears Ears represents this place where that possibility, where the confluence of Rooseveltian ideals and Native American ideals, like using the land not as a museum but as a place for ceremony, native plants. I just love the way those two stories melded and meshed. And of course, right now, I'm going to go out there and report on public lands, and they're really under threat. And I feel people seem, in our virtual world, people seem to have forgotten just how vital they were. I made a little list when I went on my trip. Uh, you know, Once I decided to do it, and Noah and I took off, and my list, I asked myself, what would Teddy do on the trip I was going on? And here it is. It's 9 things. 1, get into the wild. 2, study birds. Check, I did that one. 3, drink lots of coffee, which I also did. As probably some of you know, he was drinking coffee from dawn till dusk. That's where the Maxwell House slogan came from, him saying "good to the last drop." Um, I think Morris has a great line about him even going to sleep energetically. 4, get into spirited battles. I don't know if there are spirited battles anymore. I mean, I travel a lot on these trips that I go on for my books. And I used to feel my joke was my MO used to be a man walks into a bar. I felt like I could walk into any bar, and I felt like I could, I wrote a book about the oil spill, the Deepwater Horizon, and my main character and my friend was Ryan Lambert, who was a big hunting and fishing guide and used to tease me and call Obama your president, right? But we had the land in common, saving the land that had been besmirched by the oil or despoiled by the oil. So I hope that's still available. Get into spirited battles. 5, speak his mind. 6, learn about threatened places. 7, defend those places. 8, get in fighting trim. I tried to, go for a few runs, lift some weights. And 9, offend some people. Again, I think this is almost of its time a little bit. I'm not sure I want to offend people anymore. Um, so anyway, I made a vow not to get too political, though I did when I was looking through my book, kind of trying to. I I actually listened to a podcast I'd given 3 years ago, and I came across this quote. I think it's from Henry Adams, which I'll just let sit and be as is. Power wielded by abnormal energy is the most serious of facts. Roosevelt showed the singular primitive quality that belongs to ultimate matter. He was pure act. Um, wow. Um, and obviously, I wrote a piece, which I won't go into, uh, how ways in which Trump and TR are similar and different. The difference we can speculate on, but they both often did things by dictate. Let me just do one more thing, and I'd love to open. I don't know where we are exactly time wise, but I'd love to answer some questions. But this is, I found, I'm sure some folks know about his essay, Longitude and Latitude Among Reformers. This seemed, particularly in 2022, relevant. At the time, I was walking along a ridge, the Madahe Ridge, above where I was camped outside of Medora. And I said, what Roosevelt did politically was walk a ridge line. Um, and in this essay, he describes his route through the political world as similar to hiking along the top of a ridge line. On either side of the metaphoric ridge were two things he disliked equally. On the one side, he despised the merely successful. That's pretty extraordinary for somebody who was raised like he is and who was obviously successful and cared about success. It reminds me of Thoreau's line, the life that men praise and call successful is but one kind. So on the one side, he despised the merely successful. He would be disturbed to see the way this shallow valuation has continued and grown, our national glorification of results, whatever the means. Commercialism for its own sake was despicable to him, and the power that corporations and the rich had gained appalled him. But on the other side of the ridge was equally unappealing. This was the domain of the dogmatist. It was here that he encountered extreme do-gooders and pushers of causes who ultimately harmed their causes because their minds were not open to any vision but their own. You could say that one was what he disliked about the political right and the other about the left, somewhat. The one pushed him towards supporting issues like economic justice. The other helped him get things done. Efficiency for selfish gain was an evil. Efficiency toward a greater good was admirable. For all his dislike of the impractical reformers, he saved his greatest wrath for those who were ambitious without morals. He wrote, success is abhorrent if obtained by the sacrifice of the fundamental principles of morality. The successful man, whether in business or politics, who has risen by conscienceless swindling of his neighbors, by deceit and chicanery, by unscrupulous boldness and unscrupulous cunning, stands towards society as a dangerous wild beast. That he spoke these words emphatically goes without saying. That is one of the central paradoxes of Roosevelt. His lifelong growth, his wide and deep reading, his openness to new ideas and compassion for those not as lucky as himself, these all seem like the very definition of magnanimity. He was, to a degree few other presidents were, a scholar, writer, and thinker. and was often able to see beyond himself. But he was also a fierce advocate, and advocacy itself, while absolutely necessary, requires a certain smallness, a tightening of focus, a reduction of worldview. It sometimes even requires fighting, as if you can see nothing of value in the words of your enemy, which was exactly what I was struggling with. This book was about my decision to become more of an activist about public lands. I wanted to become, after a lifetime of Hamlet like equivocations, an advocate and activist, which was a hard thing for me to say, let alone do. It meant giving up one of my writer's main tools, the ability to see all sides. But if there was one thing I was going to put my chips down in this world, one thing I was ready to fight for, it was nature and wildness. I guess I said wilderness there. And some of you know the famous Thoreau quote gets misquoted, which is the real quote is, "In wildness is the preservation of the world." And often people say in wilderness. There's a difference, right? Um, Wildness is, I always think I did a This I Believe once on NPR. I said two of my wildest moments were close to home and weren't about wilderness. One was holding my dad's hand. He died at 56 of lung cancer, and being with him when he died, and that slowing of breathing that you probably many of you have experienced was just like this jolt of what I called wildness. I don't know what it was, something primal, and I didn't have that experience again until my daughter Hadley was born, and seeing her coming out wailing and raising her hands in victory was a truly wild moment. And I do think, though, that having said that those two human wild moments were vital to me, I do think that's something quite obviously that wilderness offers us, the chance to break out of our predictable, virtual, secondhand lives. And if we give it all away, if we sell it all out, we're going to lose something we don't even know we're going to lose. It's going to be really the guts of us, the heart of us, the soul of us. Before I start sounding like Teddy and getting on my soapbox, I'll wrap it up here, and happy to answer any questions. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much, David. I loved your book, and it was great to hear you speak more about it. I have so many notes, the things that you said. I love the contrast that you talked about, wildness versus wilderness. And I think just looking at historical empathy for TR, I felt like one of the things your book did so well was analyzing him from all different angles. So I felt like it was very balanced. So very appreciative of you sharing. And we're very excited to answer some questions from the audience. So the first one we'd like to answer is, what impressed you the most about TR?
Well, I guess what impresses someone is something you don't have, something so unlike you. And so I've got a fair amount of Rooseveltian energy. Um, I don't write as many books as him, but I write books and teach. But I guess something that just blows me away is his memory, is his ability to 20 years later quote from a book. Sometimes I can't remember, my cousin's name. I mean, this was just unbelievable, what he could do. And the whole thing about him reading a book a night, and uh, he's speed reading, obviously, but he retained stuff too. So I guess just, obviously the other thing is just the multitude of areas that were that he had expertise in, or the naval history is, his naval history was like held as the classic book for years, and that um, and I'll do one more. This is, I guess I was supposed to say the most is memory, but it's that famous line about um, it was like he would concentrated he would immediately go from concentrating fully on one thing to fully on the next, as if it were the last thing on earth. And that, wow, imagine being able to do that without flicking the TV around in between or something. That's impressive to me.
I agree about that about TR as well. I read a lot, but I'm definitely not on Tiara's level for sure.
Yeah.
All right, another question. During your research for the book, did you come across anything about Teddy that surprised you?
I'm sure I did. Let's reach back 3 books ago and try to think what the most surprising thing was. Um, well, I'd earlier read, as I said, the Morris, so I kind of had the asthma. I didn't talk much about, the famous "Build Make Your Body" story with his dad. Um, I guess what I would say is I probably had knew it before, but I just couldn't believe the way he obliterated his first wife, Alice, from his thoughts, the way he exorcised it. You know, as people who know Teddy's life know, his mother and Alice, his young bride, died on the same night, or one died at night and one died in the day. And, um, that's kind of the beginning of him leaving for the Badlands and first going to the legislature. But he doesn't, he leaves the baby with his sister, Bammy, and he doesn't mention her and he doesn't mention Alice's name. And I guess of those things, when he finally writes his autobiography, he doesn't mention her. So, and I know why he did it. He's got there's that famous line, "Black care doesn't sit behind the rider who's riding fast enough." And that's part of what he's doing out there in the Badlands, like working 24 hours a day and going crazy to get her out his head. But but it, you know, I don't know. It just seems almost inhuman, to do that with somebody you love so much.
Yes, and I
I, I
think
I get it though. I mean, yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, like, yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I think another component was also his second wife, Edith. I think she felt very strongly that she was initially the one that Tiara was attracted to. Then they had a falling out. And then, he marries
Yeah.
Alice and then they come back together. And I
Yeah.
know, I think that also played a role as well.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah,
You can picture that easily. Yeah.
absolutely. Okay, so one that we have that's not in the comments but was sent via email is in your book, you write, for TR, it all started with birds. I know that you also have quite a bit of love for birds as well, which you mentioned briefly in the presentation and also in your book as well. I know the 25th anniversary of your book, Return of the Osprey, is coming out in October. So I'd love to hear you speak about that.
Yeah. I didn't have quite the childhood fascination that he had. I haven't mentioned it, but I think one of the, again, I'm trying without being overtly political. I think one thing we can really admire is that this is the president before he was a statesman, before he was a soldier. He was a naturalist, right? And and a believer in science, very much so. In fact, thought he might be a professional naturalist scientist. So early on, I think it's on the Egypt trip. I mean, a big moment for him is when he gets glasses, and suddenly, he had great ear attuned to birds, but the glasses, suddenly the world became vivid. It also allowed him to shoot things, but that's another story. Um, and for me, I started later. Um, I got into the natural world quite a lot in hiking, but it was my first year out of college. I moved to Cape Cod, and this was 1983. So very different than now, where people stay there in the off season, and just the millions of birds migrating through at night. And I was blown away. And back then I didn't know the sound of a mourning dove from an owl, or I knew cardinals and blue jays. But I got my old Peterson's guide and started to look. And slowly but surely, even though I don't have great ears and not great eyes either, I got absorbed. And then ospreys for me were a personal symbol. I was coming back from cancer and moving back to Cape Cod. And when I was a kid, there were none there because of DDT. And so they were back, and they were big athletic birds that could dive in and they would dive and pop a wheelie and clutch fish with their talons. And I just was really attracted to them. Unfortunately, I just went on a trip up the East Coast. Their numbers are suddenly dropping because of overfishing for menhaden. So I hate I hate the fact that some of our most hopeful environmental stories are now under threat again. Obviously, that and public lands in the West, which is and there's so many fronts to be worried about, or to whatever side you're on, that it's one that gets ignored a lot. So I'm interested in getting out in there and talking to park rangers and talking to some of the indigenous people that I worked with on Bears Ears.
I
And I like
appreciate,
birds.
yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, like I have had the opportunity to see osprey, and they are just amazing, incredible birds. So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
nothing like a raptor.
and they've got their bandit mask, so they've got a little.
Uh-huh.
They're not. They've got a little. I don't know, mischief to them, I guess.
Exactly. All right, another question that's not in the comments, but was submitted. In your opinion, what outdoor experience do you think most transformed Theodore Roosevelt?
Let's think for 1 second. Am I going to go with the obvious one? I think if we do those, um, well, probably since the formative years are so important, probably those early, those trips to Europe where he, um, including the Egypt trip and the mountain climbing, like climbing the Matterhorn basically, and things were hugely important, and also kind of a battling against asthma. But I like to think that those, um, as for what I was talking about, that those early trips when he is trying to obliterate Alice from his brain and he's going on those solo hunting trips and crawling on the ground, alone for days looking, you know, after antelope, basically. Um, and then also write about another one where he's in Yellowstone, like counting the elk. It's just those kind of primal moments that he realized, uh, you, like he really wanted to be away, and he found something there. So I don't know if, maybe if I had more time, I'd come up with something different, but I think those moments were pretty important.
I think that's something that your book did so well when you went and described like the scene of Roosevelt counting the elk. Like that was one part of the book I really liked. We also
Yeah.
have in the comments another suggestion, maybe the Adirondacks, which I know was
Yeah,
very formative because that was, I think, some of his first trips. I know, like one of his camping trips, he was with his father eating
yeah,
trout. Um,
exactly. Yeah. That's
so,
a I if we could have a tournament of those, but Adirondacks is a good choice. So,
all right. So we
I
have another question. Oh, go ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say we have another question. So obviously you've talked a lot about Roosevelt, the conservationist, but I do think you intimate briefly, like you were talking about, he liked to get into battles. So our question is, why do you think Theodore Roosevelt was obsessed with fighting in battle and jumping into war when you also have this other side of him with conservation?
Well, you just mentioned the elk in Yellowstone, and I think one of the fascinating things there was the way he could be just so quiet and still for somebody that we think of this volcano and of gyrating energy. But the bellicosity was there. I mentioned Walter Jackson Bates' biography of Samuel Johnson, and there and and he too could be very brisk and ready to combative, and it was kind of wrestling with some inner aggression. It wasn't like it was something unsettled, and I think, famously, he thought, and according to Morris and McCullough, he's making up for his dad's not being in the Civil War, right, and not being part of it. And I mean, the word masculine must appear. I was just skimming through the Morris, 100 times in there, and it's a little of its time, masculine energy, but there's something in his self definition, right? That I mean, he's got many selves, but certainly that's a big one in that. And that early legislator, you know, up in Albany, like just like a little, cock ready to fight, like in the and ready to go, and learning that he had to get that a little under control. Just, I mean, or just hitting people. That happened more than once, as we know. So I don't know. It's part of the really interesting puzzle of a really interesting person, I think. And I think what's funny about that kind of cancel culture moment is Elizabeth Warren, who was running. Was it maybe she was running in 220, and when but she was asked who her favorite president was, and she said Teddy Roosevelt. And that, on the other hand, you've got a lot of conservatives who are going to say the same thing. So that's kind of hopeful in this moment. I do think that if there's ever going to, like, whatever, if there's ever going to be a rise in the Democrats, it's got to be somebody with more of an appeal to the heartland, and also have that. I mean, the cowboy thing was genius, going out to the Badlands. Otherwise, he's an effete Easterner. It's kind of like and as I write in the book, it became a tradition, through Reagan, through everybody, to kind of that's part of the kind of genius of Roosevelt.
I agree with that. And I think Roosevelt is a unifying character, which is why I find him very interesting, especially as a president.
Yeah,
Your point of different politicians from both sides of the aisle
yeah,
who
yeah.
put him as their favorite president. All right, so I'll ask one more question. If there are any burning questions after this one, we can feel free to answer them, but we'll have time maybe for one more after this. So if Roosevelt were alive today, what battles do you think he would be fighting in defense of wilderness?
Um, I think that it's kind of a inside baseball answer, but the roadless, um, act that is under threat right now for the true wilderness, the roadless wildernesses. I think, when I said before that, I mean, obviously he would be fighting the just the reduction of national monuments. I mean, that I didn't go into that too much, but it was hugely scary, um, when I was writing the book. It was it was slowly getting toward the Supreme Court. If the Antiquities Act got to the Supreme Court now, it could well be that they would rule that, um, uh, that you could reduce the land of your predecessors. It's only happened once with, President Wilson, and then, um, the Grand Canyon lawsuit was the only real ruling, and they found that it was up to the president's discretion. But if the Antiquities Act were overturned, it wouldn't just be losing the land, it would be losing the law that protects the land. So I would say that, to me, is the vital one. The roadless one is a little more, unknown, but it means these tracks where you don't build logging roads in, or you undevelop the logging roads. And again, that's keeping possibilities open for our children's children, possibilities open for the future, you know.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions. So
No questions. Where If you were my students, I'd be yelling at you. One more, come on. I stayed up late. It's 8:30 out here. You know?
well, we very much appreciate you taking your time, David, to speak with us. I think that there's so many things that we can think about, and I think there are so many of us who have a love for TR, even acknowledging some of the flaws that he has. And I think something that we can take with us is that we need a new story about wilderness. TR can't articulate it now because obviously he's been dead for over 100 years, and it's our opportunity to do so. So we appreciate you giving us that call to action, and thank everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you, and I'd love to come visit the library.
Absolutely, we'll have to have you out.
That'd be great. All right. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you,
Thank
Matt.
you.